Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Phil 114 Global Moral Issues. We're going to keep on talking about the ethics of war today, by specifically focusing on the morality of war itself. So, what we're going to do is start off with a recap of the positions that we introduced last time. Now, you guys should have done the reading for all of this getting up to it, especially since the reading's got a lot more detail than we've got time to get into. And then what we're going to do in this lecture is look at the two main readings that you looked at. So the textbook itself has one chapter of sort of overview and discussion of some of the positions, and then there's a couple of different readings that are on the different topics that we look at. So we're going to look at each of those in turn, summarizing very generally what the main points and purpose of each of those are, so that it makes it easier for you to get into and actually look at those. However, I do urge you to actually go in and do these readings. If you haven't yet, maybe watch through the video and then go back and do them. But either way, I highly recommend that you guys go back and actually look at the readings themselves and do not try and use the videos alone as substitutes for that. We just simply can't get into the same kind of detail that the authors themselves will. And there's a lot more just nuance and little details that really cement the positions together if you go back and take a look at them. But we're going to talk about pacifism, just war theory, and realism for the most part. And so, to recap and kind of refresh our memories a little bit on this, remember that realism, pacifism, and just war theory are the three main positions that we have for answering the first of our main questions for the unit, namely, how does morality apply to war? Now, realism is the position, if you recall, that moral standards and rules simply don't apply to warfare. It's an application or an embodiment of that old idea that all's fair in love and war, that anything goes, because either morality isn't really a thing, or warfare in particular is so brutal and so terrible that morality just isn't relevant to it in a lot of ways. Or at least so the position goes. Pacifism, in the context of warfare, is the position that warfare itself is never morally permissible. And this is looking only at the idea about warfare itself, not violence in general. So pacifism may still be plausible for individuals, but at the level of warfare, war is just something that's so terrible that costs so many lives, so many unintended lives, so many innocent lives, that morally speaking, it's just reprehensible. There's no way to make it justified or permissible the way that we might want it to. And then there's just war theory, which argues that warfare itself is actually morally permissible under some circumstances. So morality applies to war and permits war in certain situations. But it also has implications for how we conduct war, what sort of actions are and aren't okay for us to engage in, and how should we organize and plan the broader structures of war. Things like what sort of strategies, what amounts of force are allowed, and things like that. It's also worth reminding ourselves that each of these three are not perspectives on warfare. Instead, these are competing moral theories of warfare. These are attempts at explaining what's really going on, morally speaking, when we deal with warfare and political violence in general. Now, our focus, if you recall, is looking at how these different positions fit together and seeing how the relations between these different ideas can inform our thinking about war. Each of these three does seem to capture some sort of core idea that a lot of people treat as being very basic. A lot of people think that warfare is something that's different from ordinary civil and social human life, that a lot of the niceties and small details that we think we ought to do in everyday life simply don't apply in something as extreme as warfare. Pacifism and just war theory also capture these strong moral intuitions that we have, these uh, pre theoretical, unrefined, just senses of what things are like, this sort of intuitive understanding of what's going on. Now, intuitions like this may not always be correct, but it's some place to start. Now, there are three sets of intuitions that we have to deal with and sort of navigate between as we discuss each of these different positions, each of these different theories. First, and this seems to be acknowledged by all of the positions, war is a terrible thing, and we ought to avoid it whenever possible. This isn't necessarily just a fact about warfare, but it seems to be pretty commonly assumed, and it seems to have some real truth to it. None of these positions seem to rationally be able to defend the idea of warfare as a wonderful thing or something that you ought to do in any circumstances that work for you. So all of these positions, excuse me, tend to assume that warfare is something that we ought to avoid most of the time, or at the very least, whenever possible to, and try and achieve things in other ways. Second, these positions have different views about whether or not morality has an overriding priority compared to other norms. Pacifism and just war theory, in particular, seem to embody this intuition a bit more than the other positions. Realism, in particular, rejects this intuition. It's one of the main reasons why realism perhaps is attractive to a lot of people. It rejects this idea that morality is the most important thing that we ought to deal with when we're trying to evaluate different recommendations and standards. And then lastly, another intuition that we have to deal with all this is that a nation has the right to defend itself if attacked. And this is something that most of the views agree with. And in fact, most forms of pacifism would also agree with this. But there are a few extreme versions that are a little bit closer to what we might call global pacifism or general pacifism that might actually reject this final intuition. And so these are things to be aware of, some ideas that may come up a couple of different times as we read through things and try and notice that each of these different positions is essentially trading off between intuitions. No view on its own is able to perfectly encapsulate all of these. Um, Instead, each one is going to adopt some intuitions and reject others while trying to explain what morality in war is really like and trying to explain how morality and war relate to each other. Now, of the views that we're going to talk about today, pacifism is one of the two simpler ones, and it leans on the first intuition. So let's actually begin our discussion by looking a little bit at pacifism and what James Sturba says about pacifism and how it relates to just war theory. So, if we're getting into this in more detail, Sturba starts off his paper with a discussion of pacifism. And we might talk about how pacifism in general is supported by non consequentialist sort of theories. So, if you think back to our discussions of moral theories, we can broadly divide most of them into either consequentialist or non consequentialist umbrellas. And non consequentialist theories are ones that do not define the morality of an action based on its consequences. Instead, they look at things much more like rights or intentions or moral principles. And in general, uh, pacifists in the war sense, pacifists often lean on something like a non consequentialist theory. Oh, excuse me, I don't know what's going on there. Pacifists are going to generally lean on some kind of a non consequentialist theory to support their position. This is largely because pacifists are going to look at something like a right to life, or they're going to look at human rights as being things that we can't violate, or that there are certain things that simply are wrong to do, that there are these moral principles that we need to abide by. And most of these generally seem to imply a form of strong pacifism. That is, they seem to give a strong argument against violence in general against other human beings. And this kind of strong general pacifism is something that Sturba isn't really certain works. Sturba's overall thesis for his piece, the conclusion that he works towards throughout the entire essay, is that pacifism and just war theory, in their most defensible versions, can actually be reconciled pretty well. Essentially, there are extreme versions of both pacifism and just war theory. And Sturba thinks that we ought to reject those because the things that make those theories work really uh, don't work in the extreme versions. And when we move to the more relatable versions, the versions that we can actually rationally defend, they actually fit together fairly well. And so Sturba, at the end of the day, is actually going to argue for something somewhat like just war theory. But in his discussion of pacifism to start off with, he points out that most people, when they think about pacifism, just like you guys, I imagine for the most part, are going to identify pacifism with some kind of a theory of nonviolence, which sounds like the straight up definition if you don't think about it too much. But instead, Sturb is pointing out that pacifism, in the technical sense, in the specific sense of a view about warfare or violence, doesn't necessarily mean non-violence. Only the more global version does, the broader version that says that it's wrong to harm other people, period. If we're just talking about warfare, there are actually a couple of other varieties that we might consider. We might think about non lethal pacifism, for example. We might think that it's wrong to kill another person, but that non lethal forms of defending yourself, for example, might be perfectly acceptable. Or say, what's the word, discouraging a bully in some way using non lethal means might be justified in some circumstances. Whereas an anti warfare pacifism might say that individual violence is still perfectly justifiable in some circumstances. Surely something to be avoided when possible, but maybe there are some circumstances where it works. And it's only the large scale political violence of warfare that's actually morally impermissible. But most of us start with the straight up theory of nonviolence. And this is why I mentioned the non consequentialist theories in the first place. These are the kinds of ideas that probably most people are thinking of when they think of pacifism. So perhaps the most natural form of pacifism is, in fact, the global all violence is wrong kind of position that we've been saying we're going to try and avoid. And it's probably a good thing that we're trying to avoid it because Sturba argues that this is actually an incoherent position. The very things that make this theory appealing, namely the kind of non consequentialist accounts of human rights, like, say, something like a right to life, that all human beings have a right to life and violence violates that, and thus you shouldn't do violence. That sort of view, Sturba thinks, is actually self defeating because in order to argue for this global, strong version of pacifism, one that covers every version of violence, you have to presume something like a right to life. But at that point, you're introducing a right to life that you can't defend with force. You have very little way of actually enforcing that right. And so it's questionable how real that right actually is. Because a right, by definition, is nothing more than the ability to make a claim against another person. It's your ability to say, hey, no, stop that, with some kind of legitimate force behind it. And when it comes to something as basic as a right to life, that's in a context where violence is going to sometimes be necessary to defend it. If you have a right to life, but you're not allowed to defend yourself in some ways, it seems questionable how much of a right you really have. So Sturba thinks that the most natural version of pacifism, the one that most of us think about, one that seems like a natural consequence from those non consequentialist theories, this view just simply doesn't work, and it's not worth entertaining for very long. Similarly, Sturba says a more moderate but still quite strong version of pacifism that talks about non lethal violence being the only kind that's permissible. This also has some decent arguments against it. In general, he thinks there are simply no good arguments for it that don't also apply to better positions. Uh, the same sorts of arguments that we might use to say that it's wrong to kill, but non lethal violence is okay. These sorts of rules and principles just don't stand up in some situations. Instead, it seems like the more rational and natural position is something more like an anti warfare pacifism, where we try and avoid extreme violence or widespread violence due to the massive harm that it causes. But when necessary, individual violence is still allowed. Now, this, and the reason why he talks about it, Sturba points out that by the time we've taken a few steps back from the really extreme version of pacifism that seems the most natural position, if we were to try and just start from scratch with what pacifism is and what it demands of us, Once we've walked back from those two extreme sorts of positions, and we've come to the anti warfare pacifism, Sturba argues that it actually starts looking an awful lot like just war theory. Because anti warfare pacifism, what I'm just going to call pacifism from here on out, this places restrictions on violence that look an awful lot like the same restrictions that just war theory puts out. In particular, it's worried about harming innocent people or non combatants, people who are not involved in warfare. Because at the individual level, it's perfectly justifiable to defend yourself. So if we're talking about soldiers in war, or we're talking about political violence in general, then soldiers have a right to defend themselves from attacking soldiers. And so general violence in warfare is going to be perfectly fine. It's only going to be the extreme forms of things where it's wrong for a soldier to attack somebody who's not an enemy soldier, to attack an innocent bystander. And it's probably going to be wrong, or almost certainly going to be wrong on this sort of view, to kill just for fun or for sport, or to do things that cause extra harm just for the sake of causing harm. Instead, anything you do needs to be proportional to what you're receiving. If you are being attacked with lethal force, defend with lethal force, but don't defend yourself in a way that's going to cause more harm than what they're doing. Don't become the worst monster of the two of you. So these kinds of restrictions, which seem to be sort of common sense implications of an anti-warfare pacifism, this sounds an awful lot like the same rules offered by the jus in bello of just war theory, the same restrictions put on by the morality in that applies in warfare. And so this starts raising questions about how different these things are. Are these kinds of restrictions justified? Are these things that we can rationally draw distinctions on? And if we can, if this view really does stand up to scrutiny, then pacifism, the only plausible form of pacifism, might actually look an awful lot like just war theory. And so Sturba argues that the main question we have to ask then has to do with accidental harms. Because, like I just mentioned a minute ago, uh, intentional harms to enemy combatants, that is, to actual enemy soldiers, seems to be perfectly fine. The worry is having to do with accidental harms and the ones that we don't intend, the byproducts of war, the things that truly make it a tragic situation rather than just terrible in general. Now, well, as I was just saying, I guess I was getting ahead of myself. With warfare, one of the main worries that we have is the massive loss of life from non combatants. I personally have been fortunate enough to not have to be involved in any armed conflict in my life, so I cannot speak from a personal experience on this sort of thing, and I will not pretend to have personal experience on this sort of type of topic. But at a theoretical level, in an abstract sense, one of the main concerns that people have with the morality of warfare is not just that it's soldiers killing soldiers, because in some situations that sort of thing may be justified if you're defending a nation against enemy fighters, or if you're fighting to defend an ally in some ways. These sorts of things seem to be acceptable. The main worries are the byproducts of war, when women and children and unenlisted men are affected by warfare, when people who are trying to simply live peaceful lives are killed or harmed or displaced by the actions involved in warfare. And so these are sorts of the things that are generally considered to be unjustified or impermissible things going on in war. And even more so when these sorts of things are intended. But we often draw a distinction, at least intuitively speaking, between intentional harms and accidental harms. If you kill somebody on purpose, you're going to get sent to jail with a far worse sentence than if you accidentally killed somebody. It's why in the United States we have a difference between the charges of murder and manslaughter, or even things like accidental homicide, depending on the jurisdiction. So intuitively, we seem to be tempted to draw a kind of distinction between intentional harms and accidental harms. And Sturba gets curious with this idea. If we can draw a distinction between intentional and accidental harms. And if we treat these differently, this might have implications for how we view pacifism and how this general anti warfare pacifism, this less extreme, more moderate position that we have arrived at a minute ago, that this might actually look an awful lot like just war theory. So, the first thing that we need to do then is test whether or not this distinction actually holds water, whether or not we're actually justified in making distinctions between intentional harms and accidental harms, what we might call foreseen harms or only foreseen. And this kind of distinction comes up in actions that generally have two kinds of effects, what we might call a double effect action or an action with double effects. An action with double effects is one that has both good and bad consequences, some of which we are intending and some of which we just expect to happen. Think back to like the trolley problems for an example of this sort of thing. Throwing the lever in the first trolley car situation is something that is going to hurt somebody. You're going to kill the worker on the side track, but that wasn't the intent. That wasn't the purpose of the action. Instead, the goal was to actually save as many workers' lives as possible. But you knew that one worker would still die. You foresaw that death, but you didn't intend it. You weren't trying to kill that poor guy on the sidetrack. Now, Sturba thinks that if we can keep that distinction going in warfare, and if we're justified in treating those two kinds of actions differently, that is, if we treat intentional harms and accidental harms differently, then we might be able to paint a picture of warfare that looks a lot like both pacifism and just war theory, which is interesting for what that tells us about what's actually viable as a moral theory of war. So, Sturba comes up with a pair of ideas, two different tests that he thinks we can do to ask ourselves what's going on in these situations with two effects. And the first and main thing that he relies on is what's called the counterfactual test. The counterfactual test essentially asks two questions about actions with both good and bad results. The first of these is, would you have done the action if you could achieve the good result without the bad result? That is, it's asking about a counterfactual. It's asking about something that didn't actually happen. In an alternate world, in another version of everything that happened, if you could have done this without getting the bad effects, would you? And generally, most of us are going to say yes on those kinds of things. But if we are asking about situations in warfare, say where in order to stop an enemy advance, we have to do a kind of attack or a bombing run or something that harms civilians, then the questions start getting a whole lot murkier and a whole lot more important. Because if we could do a certain action without having the more negative effects, then that says something about what our actual intent is. It tells us a little bit more about what we're actually attempting to do and which intentions we should be judged and measured on. Now, the second question involved with all this is, would you have done the action if only the bad result had occurred? And again, this helps clarify what the intention is for a given action. And by clarifying this intention, we can better nail down what's an intended effect versus just an accidental harm that happens, something that's just merely foreseen. And then to help add even more onto this, Sturba suggests that we also use what he calls the explanation test. Does bringing about the bad result help explain why the agent did the action? So let's consider a minute what an application of this sort of thing looks like, and pause and sort of like make sure we've got our bearings, because there's a lot of moving parts here. I know that it's probably easy to miss the forest for the trees as we move through this argument. So, Sturba's main point is that pacifism overall, in its extreme forms, doesn't work. It's only acceptable in a more moderate, restrained version. But he thinks that that more restrained version looks an awful like just war theory and may be virtually the same sort of view, which seems to be an argument for just war theory as opposed to pacifism, since the only reasonable position practically is just war theory. So, in order to test this sort of thing, we need to see what restrictions anti warfare pacifism places on actions. If those restrictions look the same as what just war theory puts on, then we know that those are almost the same sort of view. So, what restrictions come from anti warfare pacifism? Well, the main worry is what happens to non combatants. This is one of the biggest things that pacifists worry about in general. It's one of the strongest reasons in favor of being a pacifist. That war uniquely causes massive loss of life to innocent people, people who are not involved in all of the nonsense that governments get up to. So, if we're worried about non combatants, then we need to know the difference between uh, intended harms, that is, the harms and damages that a particular group is trying to cause, and accidental harms. If we want to have a moderate and reasonable version of pacifism that is worried about this sort of thing, if it's worried about the massive accidental loss of life, we need to know whether or not this accidental loss of life is something that we ought to treat morally differently. That is it viable as a matter of practicality in warfare to actually be able to identify and treat differently situations where non combatants are intentionally harmed versus accidentally harmed? Because intentionally harmed stuff we know is wrong. You don't have to be a pacifist to say it's wrong to just straight up attack civilians, even the more moderate pacifists we've been looking at. But if moderate pacifism is going to work, then we need to know that in some situations, it might actually be all right to accidentally harm non combatants. That is, unintended harms may be less bad or more permissible than the intended versions. So we have these couple of tests. If we can, as a matter of practicality in war situations, clearly identify what the intentions of a given group are, or what the intent involved in an individual action is, then we can better see and apply our intuitive understanding of, well, intentional harms are worse than accidental ones. And so Sturba gives these couple of tests. Now, with these tests, Sturba says, we can actually start to apply moral rules that satisfy both pacifism and just war theory. So long as we can make this distinction, we can come down more harshly again on intentional harms against non-combatants. We can put restrictions in place that allow this moderate form of pacifism to be satisfied and still say that warfare in a lot of cases is acceptable, or at least under very strict conditions is acceptable. And considering the applications of this shows that this general idea is kind of plausible. If we actually do treat intentional harms and accidental harms differently, well, that seems to fit the intuitions we were just talking about. It fits the way that we want to talk about morality, and it fits our general moral experience, which, if you remember from our discussions of moral theories, are criteria that we look for in good moral theories. Now, furthermore, these are the same kinds of distinctions and the same kind of worries and applications that just war theory focuses on. So just like pacifism has a unique set of worries that it worries about, and particular things that it wants to try and avoid, such as the massive loss of life of non-combatants, just war theory is going to similarly want to address certain issues, namely that massive widespread destruction is not something that we ought to allow when we have to go to war or when we think it's justified to go to war. Extreme versions of just war theory, maybe some of the more natural versions of it, are going to say something very loose and permissive, saying that war in a wide variety of circumstances is perfectly acceptable. For example, traditional just war theory says that a justified war has to have a good cause. It has to be done for the right sorts of reasons, and it can't intentionally harm innocents. And that it must use only measures and means that are proportional to its objections. So, traditional just war theory, the natural versions of just war theory, have certain restrictions built into them. They're very, very general. And Sturber runs through a few applications and cases where these things show up. But uh, the main things that seem plausible from a just war theory, the things that seem the easiest to defend, look an awful lot like the same sorts of restrictions that come out of our moderate pacifism. Namely, we're worried about accidentally harming non-combatants. We worry about the intentions behind an action, and we try and come down differently on intentional harms versus accidental harms. So, the things that each theory is concerned with and the moral rules that each one proposes, that we make this distinction, they seem to be virtually the same thing. And the test that he's been talking about, the counterfactual test, is something that does seem to be able to be applied in warfare. If we run through his sets of examples, it seems like we can plausibly actually apply this test and get something like a clear answer in each case. So, both views use the same sorts of distinctions. Both views suggest the same kinds of restrictions, and the thing that we need to apply those restrictions, this distinction between uh, intentional harm and accidental harm, seems to be plausible to actually be done in warfare. So, according to Sturba, these two views perhaps are not in as much disagreement as we might think. Pacifism on its face looks like an entirely incompatible view with just war theory. But Sturba says, anyway, that the only plausible versions that we can actually defend for each one really end up looking about like the same thing, which seems to imply that just war theory is, in fact, the right way to think about things, rather than the stronger forms of pacifism that we talked about in the first place. So, we might ask, so what? So the views resemble each other. Why worry about this sort of stuff? Why get into all this mess with the counterfactual tests and everything else? Well, so long as there are some sort of good reasons to allow political violence, morally speaking, so long as there are some circumstances where it's okay, well, that seems to only be true if we can actually have some of these different restrictions and worries. That's said badly. To rephrase this, if there really are restrictions on warfare, if it turns out that extreme versions of pacifism aren't plausible, and if it turns out that distinctions between intentional harm and accidental harm are plausible to apply in war, if it's practical to actually make that kind of distinction and to place the intuitive restrictions on things that we want to, that means that there may be good reasons to allow political violence. There may be good reasons to actually engage in warfare so long as we restrict it in the right sorts of ways. There may be situations where, so long as we follow these restrictions, it's perfectly acceptable, morally speaking, to go to war, to try and act on some sort of a just cause. But that kind of conclusion, that maybe so long as we can apply these restrictions, things are all right, this may not be the right way of thinking about things. There is a second, more general question to be asking with all this. Namely, why think that morality applies at all? If the whole last essay was really about, we have these intuitions about intentional harm versus accidental harm, and on both pacifism and just war theory, we want to say, okay, violence is permissible, but we need to treat these differently, and we need to put restrictions on things. That only makes sense if morality applies in the first place. That is, if those intuitions are actually plausible to apply to the things that happen in warfare. And so we might ask, what about realism? Why not reject these moderate, somewhat watered down versions of pacifism and just war theory? And why not just adopt some form of realism? And so here we have an essay by the fellow by the name of Michael Walzer, who is one of the most famous and well known contemporary advocates for just war theory. And Walzer argues in his essay against realism, no surprise that realism's false. He argues that if morality exists at all, then the main arguments for realism simply don't work. That is, the things that realism thinks it's saying about war are just false. So, Walzer goes through his argument something like this. The main argument for realism, Walzer says, is that war is a brutal place where inhumane things are simply necessary. We have to do terrible things in war, the realist says, because otherwise we're going to perish, we're going to die. War is just too terrible to allow such things as restrictions and judging things differently and all this. You just do what you have to do in warfare, according to the realist. And we might even phrase it as it's a brutal truth that humanity simply has to be brutal in something like war. Quoting straight out of the essay, the defenders of silent leges, just this general idea that the law must be silent in war, the defenders of this idea claim to have discovered an awful truth. That is, namely, that there are no restrictions in warfare. All is fair in something like this. Moral judgments just don't apply. But Walzer doesn't think that this is true. Walzer disagrees that this is an accurate characterization of war, and he looks at a series of historical examples to try and show that the way we experience war and the way that we recognize certain norms and standards and things like that in it show that norms and standards and rules and restrictions still very much apply to war. There's no reason to leave morality out of that situation, no matter how high the stakes are and no matter how brutal things get. And so Walzer goes through a couple of different historical examples, which I will not focus on all of them, but we'll run through the biggest one that I think makes his example the most clearly. And that's the example of things from the ancient Peloponnesian War. So the Peloponnesian War was a conflict between the Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta back in, like what we might call the classical age, or the period of time from around when Plato and Socrates and your other famous Greek civilizations and people were running around and doing their things. This isn't a history class. I'm not worried about you getting dates and all specifics on this. But during the Peloponnesian conflicts, after the Greeks had repelled the Persian Empire, the story that you see in movies like 300 and so on, after repelling the Persian Empire, the Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta had developed fairly large empires, and they've started to come into conflict with each other. Athens, in particular, is trying to expand its empire and survive. Sparta is a military culture, and according to the Athenians, if they don't expand, they'll lose territory and suffer in a lot of ways. The Spartans will continue their advance, they will expand, they will make the Athenians' lives far, far worse. And so the Athenians are working to expand their empire as much as possible. And so near the city-state of Athens, near the core of Athens' empire, is the small nation of Melos. Now, officially, Melos is a Spartan colony, but it's also neutral in the conflict. Melos has had no part in the wars and the conflicts so far. And Athens does not like this. Athens is a large empire ready to do its thing, wanting to expand, wanting to increase its wealth, its slaves and servants, its knowledge, its money, just everything they can expand, they want to. And Athens has considered the existence of Melos just right off their shores to be a grave threat to them, really. So the Athenian generals contact the rulers of Melos and they offer a deal. Either you submit and join our empire and become our servants, or we're going to destroy all of Melos. We're going to raze the city to the ground. We're going to enslave the people, slaughter all of the potential soldiers, because basically we can't afford to have you nearby. You're making us look bad. If we have a neutral Spartan colony right off our shores and we've not done anything about it, it makes us look weak, the Athenians say. And so they offer this deal to the colony of Melos. Either bend the knee and submit, or we will destroy you. And the Melians, to no great surprise, who don't like the idea of basically becoming slaves and third class citizens in the Athenian Empire, refuse. They are a Spartan colony, they're neutral. The Spartans will back them up eventually. So they say no. And so the Athenians slaughter them. The Athenians kill every military age man that they can find. They enslave the women and children and the non combatants and basically wage a truly brutal war against Melos. Now, this seems like just a random snippet out of ancient history. But the interesting thing about the whole thing is the discussion and the deal that's made with Melos, because the whole thing is recorded by a set of historians that we look to for things from the classical age. And so, what's interesting from the whole discussion is the justification that the Athenian generals give in favor of destroying Melos. The Athenian generals don't say, oh, we just want to get rid of your island. We don't like it. It's not just a matter of preference and random serial killer sociopathy. It's not just the dreams of having a bigger empire. The Athenian generals talk about Melos as being something they have to deal with. We must do it. It's necessary that we deal with this. And they essentially argue for a version of realism. They essentially say, look, things are so bad in this kind of business, in the business of war and empire and ruling, that if we don't do this, we're going to be destroyed. So even though it's a terrible thing to destroy Melos, even though it's something that's going to bring dishonor on us, the citizens back in Athens are not going to approve of this. None of the politicians, the philosophers, nobody is going to believe that we've done the right thing here. But we have to. We must do this in order to survive. And so the Athenian generals talk about, like, don't dress this up in pretty language. Don't pretend like this was the holy and correct thing to do. We're doing something terrible here, but we need to do this. That whole discussion, that whole justification, Walzer points out, is interesting because the language they're using is effectively the language of strategy. That is, they're discussing things in terms of what must be done as a matter of warfare. What do we have to do to survive? What do we have to do to win? What are the things that we ought to do to achieve this kind of end? And this kind of discussion, these terms, this way of talking about things, is fundamentally normative. It's action guiding. It talks about what you ought to do in given situations. And that language, that normative structure, is the same exact kind of structure that morality uses. It's fundamentally normative. And Walzer basically says that if you can use normative language of strategy in warfare, like you can in every situation, then it should be possible for morality to apply as well. Essentially, if there's room for strategy and those kinds of concepts, then there's enough room for morality still to apply. And additionally, our experience of morality and our experience of the moral realities of war shows this. Even if we just go back to the Melian example from the Peloponnesian War, the Athenian generals knew that they were doing a terrible thing. This wasn't everything's terrible and we just don't know what's right and wrong anymore. No, the Athenian generals knew that by brutally wiping out and enslaving all of Melos, they were doing something morally reprehensible. They were doing something dishonorable and cruel and terrible. And because they could recognize that, that shows that they still understood and believed that moral rules applied. They just were trying to ignore them and be somewhat hypocritical in the whole situation. And similarly, soldiers face moral regrets. It's one thing to talk about the psychological harm and toll that our armed forces pay when we deal with combat and everything else. But it's also just simply a fact that regardless of the psychological influences, soldiers have regrets for the things they do. Some people are haunted by the things that they do in warfare. And I don't want to pass any sort of judgment in those sorts of actions or situations. I don't know what warfare is like on a personal level. But it seems pretty safe to say that in at least some instances, history at least has shown us that some things that are done in war are truly atrocious and inhumane and immoral. And that seems totally accurate. In fact, realists themselves will use this kind of language. They'll talk about how terrible warfare is. But Walzer argues that this kind of description, this kind of classification, only makes sense if morality actually applies to war. These concepts seem to apply just fine. We can make sense out of the moral reality of war, and if we can make sense of it, why don't the standards actually apply? Why shouldn't we be following them? In effect, Walzer's arguing that if morality makes sense anywhere, it must also apply to warfare. If we are moral human beings, if we're the kinds of people that care about morality in any part of our lives, then we treat it as something we ought to do. When we recognize what we ought to do, we should do it. And what we shouldn't do, what we recognize we shouldn't do. Similarly, we've got this whole area of human experience, war, that we can recognize what should and shouldn't be done, at least in some instances. And in other instances, there's room for us to talk about what we should and shouldn't do as a matter of strategy. But if that works, if we can make sense of that, then the only way to be consistent through this whole thing, the only way to actually make the moral point of view mean anything, is if we're consistent with it, as if we apply morality everywhere, including to warfare. The only way morality means anything, the only way we're going to avoid being self serving hypocrites, is to apply morality everywhere where we see to apply it. Realism seems to require that we both be able to recognize what's moral and not moral, and then ignore it just because warfare is difficult and terrible. And this seems to be an implication that we shouldn't accept, Walzer says. The view basically has too high of a cost to pay. It costs us our morality and our dignity and the whole idea of being moral creatures. So, Walzer says, we should reject realism. It's just simply not the case that morality doesn't apply. So, some form of morality applies, according to Walzer. And if that's the case, and we generally want to, if we want to tie this back in with the other reading, if morality does apply to warfare, as the way Walzer argues that it does, then the same sorts of restrictions and different levels of punishment that we want to give, or different levels of blame that we want to give to intentional harm versus accidental harm, then these should apply to warfare. And this seems to suggest that some form of just war theory is true, which looks an awful lot like the moderate version of pacifism that's the only version worth defending, according to our other fellow. So, altogether, these seem to come together to paint the picture of just war theory being true. But there's a lot of stuff going in all of these readings. And so, even though that seems to be the picture that these two taken together argues for, here we ought to pause and actually ask ourselves, but is that right? Is this the correct way to be thinking about morality? Because so far we've looked at two different essays with rather detailed descriptions and examples and arguments, probably more complex than we really expected to be getting into this early in the semester. But in each of those instances, there may be mistakes that were made. Perhaps the stronger versions of pacifism do make sense. And so the early rejections of those in the first piece we talked about, maybe those rejections don't actually make sense. Maybe we really should endorse the stronger, more global forms of pacifism, in which case pacifism and just war theory do not look alike, and we can't just sort of reduce one down to the other. We have to still really consider pacifism as an option. Or maybe realism really has a reply to Walzer's argument. Maybe Walzer is giving a decent argument in favor of applying morality to war, but maybe the realist has some kind of reply to this. Maybe there are either faults in Walzer's own argument, or maybe there's things that he's missing. Maybe the realist has some additional reasons for treating morality in warfare and out of warfare differently, just like we have reasons for treating intentional harm and accidental harm differently. So we don't have to agree with any of our authors so far. We don't have to agree with the joint picture these two essays seem to stitch together. Uh, we just need to be careful and rational about why we disagree. It's fine to. I encourage you to disagree. We shouldn't automatically go for just war theory just because a couple of essays say it. But if we're going to reject these things, we ought to know why. We ought to know which parts stand out as seemingly implausible or untrue or unacceptable in some ways. Are there bits that don't seem to support their conclusions? Are there jumps in the logic? These are the kinds of things that we ought to look at as we move forward and kind of think through and digest these different ideas. So, this is where we have to part ways for now. Next time, as far as the lectures go, we're going to look at some of the applications of just war theory and what it might mean for terrorism, torture, and warfare, and look at some of those applications of the jus in bello in particular. And we're going to, in particular, use the example of the ticking time bomb scenario, a famous philosophical problem, to sort of illustrate some of what these applications and questions might be, and what some of the issues surrounding torture and terrorism might mean for warfare in general, and for how we conduct society in general. In the meantime, though, I highly encourage you to take a look at the first journal for the unit, to start trying to digest some of the stuff we've talked about this time, and start trying to really think about how morality and warfare might fit together. Because again, as citizens of the world, we have a responsibility to have some sort of an opinion about this kind of stuff. We need to at least have some idea of what we think morality and warfare have to do with each other, if they do have anything to do with each other. So take some time, look at that first journal, do a little bit of self-reflection, digest the stuff a little bit, and let me know if you've got any questions or things that you want to discuss. I'd be more than happy to try and clear stuff up with you, or at the very least discuss things in greater detail. Until then, though, good luck with the rest of your studies. Hope your semester's going well, and happy thinking.